Hello, I'm Robin, and welcome to Bookspin. So, Alastair Reynolds' latest release, Machine Vendetta, came out last month. Here it is. This marks the long awaited conclusion to the Prefect Dreyfus Emergency trilogy. Now, I really enjoyed this book. I put up a review on his channel the other day, and I love this series as a whole. So, I decided to get back in touch with the author so we could have a chat and I could learn more about his work on this series and his background as a science fiction writer.
Okay, so we've got Alastair Reynolds here with us today. So thank you very much, Alastair, for sparing some time for me this evening. And congratulations on the publication of Machine Vendetta, which has just come out in the UK and the US as well, I think.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's all just fresh off the press, really, that one now.
Yeah, so it came out last month. I just finished reading it last night, and I can honestly say it was a great pleasure to read. I really enjoyed it. For those who don't know, it's the third book in a series, the Prefect Dreyfus Emergency series, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But before we get into that, I just thought perhaps we should just get a bit of background discussion on your SF writing and your scientific background, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in the past, you've worked as a space scientist, I believe, as a researcher for the European Space Agency. And this was kind of alongside or perhaps predating your creative writing career. So what came first? Was it the science or the science fiction? And what prompted the change for you to become a full-time author?
Well, the two interests in, I suppose, space and science fiction and the future and all the sort of questions about what's out there in the universe, I think they were sort of always, they're two strands that go right back into my early childhood. So I can't really separate out which one came first. There were certain role model scientists on television when I was growing up, like Spock and Doctor Who. So they were obviously quite important, I think, in my sort of, as a child, sort of my understanding of what a scientific figure represented. And they were attractive role models as well. And then I wasn't super. I didn't have particular aptitude for science as a pupil at school, particularly weak at mathematics. But I wanted to do science, and that was the thing that spurred me. I worked against my the areas I wasn't good at. It was a certain bloody mindedness that I was going to become a scientist, because the sort of expectation when I was doing my O levels and A levels was that I would probably go into creative arts, maybe illustration or something like that, because that was what I was. The only thing I was really naturally good at was sort of painting and drawing. I was okay at creative writing, but everyone thought I'd just be an illustrator or something like that. But I really wanted to be a scientist. And I think it was sort of the thing that crystallized it particularly was when Carl Sagan had his TV series Cosmos on, which was, I believe, around 1980, 81 in the UK. But that had a big impact on me, particularly because it didn't just touch on scientific themes about evolution and the universe and extraterrestrial intelligence and things like that, but they also had interviews with sort of real scientists, and he'd sort of drive around and he'd go and sort of interview someone working at a telescope or something like that, and you got an insight into that this was it wasn't a career just for weirdos. It was something. It was sort of it was accessible. I thought, oh, maybe I can have a bit of that as well. So I had a strong aspiration, probably from about the age of 14, 15. It was pushing me towards a career in science, but I was also trying to be a sort of science fiction writer at the same time. I'd always written stories in school, and I never really stopped doing that. And I was that kid who, they give you an assignment and they say, go home and write 2 pages on what you did in your summer holidays, and I'd come back with like 20 pages. I'd always over deliver. So there was something that was trying to get out, and whatever the creative topic assignment was, I would always bend it in a sort of genre direction. So using my teachers, I'd always make it either horror or science fiction, one or the other. So that was happening, and then I obviously I was reading science fiction quite widely, and then I sort of started reading some of the writers who had collections of their short stories, and at some point the penny dropped that these hadn't just been put into a book for the first time, that they'd actually been in magazines prior to that. And I realized there was a sort of like a path to publication that seemed to work for writers, which was to write short stories, somehow get them into magazines, and then you sort of build up something of a name for yourself, and then then you can start doing the novels and stuff. So I basically was just trying to emulate the pathway that I'd seen some of the writers I was reading follow, and I suppose particularly when I was at 15 or 16, I was getting really excited about science fiction. It was people like Larry Niven, Joe Haldeman, and Gregory Benford, and then I'd already read sort of Clarke and Asimov by that point, but I think it was looking at the career trajectories of the writers who were a little bit younger, a little bit more relatable, because rather than, if you were sort of like a kid in the 80s, Asimov was born in the 20s, so he seemed like a really distant time period. He was this kind of old guy. Whereas you could kind of vaguely relate to the writers who'd come up in the 40s and 50s, been born in the 40s and 50s. They seemed a little bit more closer to the present, and their sort of life stories were a little bit more relatable. So I started trying to emulate them, but that was also what I was trying to get my school grades, and then I sort of eventually got onto a science course at university. But I was even then I was sort of carrying on trying to write science fiction as a kind of hobby in the background, and learning more and more about the magazines, and finding out that there was a British magazine called Interzone, taking out a subscription to it, sending them stuff. So I was on that sort of pathway, but at the same time, I had serious plans to have a career in science. I thought that would sort of be what I did for the rest of my life.
I see. So
it took me to the space agency in the end, But.
So where did you first get published? Were you published in a magazine?
Yes. Technically the first piece of fiction I ever got paid for was in a schools magazine, and it's quite I think it was quite important to me developmentally. So I'd written there was a creative writing assignment in our school, and it was actually I wrote a piece of fiction, but it was actually on a political theme. It wasn't a genre piece at all. Right. It was the sort of decline of industry and betrayal of the working classes in South Wales or something like that, and I wrote a piece of fiction. My teacher liked it, and if I remember rightly, it was put into a sort of a regional competition for creative writing in South Wales in schools, and I won a prize for that. I won £5, which was really nice.
Yeah,
money, and exactly the right amount of money to go down W.H. Smith's and buy a record for £4.99. So there was that symbolism as well. Like, I bought a record, but I think it was the one they published that they did the magazine as a printed circulation around South Wales schools. So I actually got to see my story typeset, and that was a big sort of jolt for me, because I realised that whatever you've written, it looks better when it's typeset. It just has an automatic authority about it. I thought, okay, so that's interesting. So everything looks better when it's. I mean, people don't have that revelation anymore, because they go straight to writing on computers. But I'd written in longhand, and then typewriters was another story. But that was a big validation for me, so that I think that was important. And then it wasn't that, it was only maybe a year or two later that I started sending stuff to Interzone, and they took which was that's the magazine that eventually bought my first story. And they didn't buy one immediately. It took about 5 years before they took a story off me. But I then had I would say, a long-lasting association with Interzone, which sort of followed through my first 10 years as a published writer. Was really just publishing short stories, and Interzone was the mainstay of my publishing.
So this was before Revelation of Space.
Yeah, you're going back. I mean, technically, I'm a writer from the 80s, because my first sale to Interzone, I actually sold it to them in 1989, but they didn't publish it till a year later. But I always think, well, I'm kind of in that decade, I'm a bit like Cliff Richard, we're sort of 4 or 5 decades of publishing now. But so I got into Interzone right at, in terms of being published, it was 1990, so they took 2 of my stories in that year. And then within a year or 2, I had a couple of things elsewhere. But for most of the 90s, it was really just Interzone. And then there was, towards the end of the decade, there was a little bit of interest from sort of like Asimov science fiction magazine in America. So I was starting to get a little traction internationally. Okay. But then, obviously, a 10-year sort of what do they call it? 10 years of sort of hard slog before the novel came out. Apprenticeship. Right. That I'm looking for.
But during that time, you had your career in this astronomer, is that right?
Space scientist? Yeah. Well, it sort of overlaps with. I was doing my PhD in Scotland, so I did a degree in Newcastle in astronomy. I wanted to carry on in astronomy, so I took up a PhD course in St Andrews in Scotland. In 1988, I went up there for the first time, and then I stayed there for 3 years. So 88 to 91, that's basically the period where I broke into the magazines and felt that I actually had a chance of being published. So it's it was an important time. And then immediately after getting my doctorate, I moved to the Netherlands to work for the European Space Agency. And then again, it was sort of the first time in my life it was something like a day job, with sort of reasonably sensible hours. So I after a sort of period of transition, I began to sort of set aside a little bit of time in the evenings to start working on a novel properly. I mean, there'd been any number of false starts on novels before that, and I'd written a couple of novels in my teens, which were just really good experience, but they weren't in any way publishable. But once I was settled down in the Netherlands, which was sort of 1991, 92, then I could really start focusing my personal time on writing more and writing longer. So that's when the sort of roots of Revelation Space sort of take hold.
Okay, so I've got Revelation Space here.
Yeah,
which I think came out in 2000, if I'm right.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of hard SF space opera. Is that a fair description, do you think?
Oh, yeah, I mean,
okay.
I'm always a bit wary of this term hard science fiction, because I think it sets up expectations that I'm not necessarily interested or capable of delivering.
Okay.
I think it's a novel. There is science in there, but it's not sort of strongly foregrounded. It's more that I think it's more like it's a story that takes place in a universe which kind of works according to the rules as we know them, but it's not a book where the physics is sort of front and center of the story.
In any case, this was your debut novel. It went on to become quite an epic series, and I think for a lot of readers, this is often their entry point to your work. It certainly was for me.
They stop as well, quite conveniently.
Yeah, and it's also, in a sense, the parent series for the Prefect Dreyfus books, which are set within the same universe. So, I mean, how would you describe Revelation Space and the series that followed to someone who is unfamiliar with your work?
I've sort of had to sort of think about what was I doing, what am I doing, where am I going with it, because it was never conceived as an extended series of books. That's the first thing I should say, because I didn't know if I was going to have a career. Even when I had a book deal for Revelation Space, it was a three book deal, and I didn't know if it was going to lead to anything. I mean, a lot of good books come out and they don't find an audience, and then second or third books don't necessarily do very well off the back of them, and then that's maybe the last you hear of people. I mean, so I was sort of like really not banking on anything at all. But what had happened was, prior to me getting a deal for Revelation Space, a couple of years before the offer, so this would have been the mid 90s, I'd started writing another story, which just happened to be set in the same universe, and that had become an early draft of Chasm City. So I'd written that purely for myself. I didn't have any sort of plans for it beyond writing a book and sort of seeing how I felt with it. And I never submitted it. So I thought I'll let Revelation Space find its place in the world, and then I'll worry about Chasm City later. And the when I sort of first started having a conversation with Galance about them taking me on, they sort of said, "Well, we like this book, but have you written anything else?" And I said, "Well, I got this other thing, which is kind of in the same universe." And they were really pleased to hear that, because then they could see a sort of, I suppose, a marketing strategy. They could do the first book, and then another book connected to it would follow on, and then the natural thing then was that the book that followed would be also in the same universe. So that set a certain pattern for going forward from Revelation Space. But I say, when I wrote Revelation Space, I really didn't have any inkling that it would lead to anything else. And I think the putting in the sort of the building off it into other books really only happened in the latter stages of the editing process, when I knew that there was going to be more material to come. But it was planned. And again, the carrying on from there was another 3-book deal. And again, I thought, well, I'm really lucky. I've got another 3-book deal, but I'm not going to think beyond that. I'm just going to write these books now and see where they take me.
Yeah.
And it was I did the way it went. I did Revelation Space. Then Chasm City was, to some extent, a book that was already written, although it required a lot of revision before it was ready to be published, mainly because it was too short. And then I did Redemption, which was direct follow-on to Revelation Space, and that was the end of those the first 3-book deal. The beginning of the second 3-book deal, I did Absolution Gap, and that was also the period in my life where I decided to step away from science as a full-time profession. There's a lot of pressure in managing a day job and also writing a book a year, because obviously Revelation Space was already a done deal. Chasm City was to some extent a done deal. Redemption Arc came quite easily, but gradually the pressure was building, because I was it was getting hard. I was having to do more and more work each year to write these books. I thought, so Absolution Gap, I thought, I'm going to step away from this universe for a bit. I want to do something different now, and sort of plant a flag elsewhere in science fiction and say, I'm not just going to do this sort of gothic hard SF space opera stuff, whatever you want to call it. I want to show that there's more to me as a writer. So then one after that was Century Reign, which was a sort of murder mystery, a noir alternate history murder mystery thing. And then straight after that, I'd had some ideas about dealing with alien intelligence, extraterrestrial intelligence, in a way that wouldn't work within the parameters of the Revelation Space universe. So I was thinking about First Contact and things like that. And that was kind of the itch that needed to be scratched, which is why I wrote Pushing Ice, which was the next book. It was only when I had that all done. But I thought about returning to the Revelation Space universe, and one of the sort of conversations I'd had with my editor at the time was that it would be nice to go back in time a bit, because the first 4 books are all set after the Golden Age, so it's a kind of decaying time where there's sort of this plague has come through and ruined everything, and it's all very it's very Gothic and decrepit and quite fun, that environment.
Yeah.
It's a bit like Black Death sweeping through Europe. But equally, it could be interesting to go back before that and tell a story about this civilization when it was at its sort of utopian heights. And I thought, it's a nice idea in principle, but I need to how do you actually tell a story within the framework of a sort of a high-tech utopia? It's just, fiction depends on drama and conflict, and it's a bit difficult if things are working perfectly and everyone's happy. But at some point, I sort of came up with this idea that I'd focus on sort of the main theme of the books is this kind of organization that monitors the democratic process within these space habitats. And I thought that could be quite good, because you can really, if your main characters are sort of police officers, they can go anywhere and do anything. They can really get under the hood of a society and see it from all its different levels, which is really, it's really what going back to what Raymond Chandler was saying about the detective as a figure in fiction. He's a man who can move in any social circle, and he can look in any door. There's nothing he can't examine. And I thought, well, so that was that led me into the sort of kind of a detective mode for those books. And I was also at the time a big fan of the TV series 24, which I still think is good, but it was particularly big at the time, and the sort of format of 24 was, there'd be a sort of unfolding terrorist emergency that this team had to neutralize. And I thought, well, that could be a good sort of template for these books. There's a little team of experts that are trying to put out these fires in this high-tech society. So that was the sort of genesis of the first Prefect book.
Which leads me on to this book.
Yeah.
Aurora Rising, originally titled The Prefect.
Prefect, yeah.
Okay. So I was going to ask you about how this idea was conceived. But I do think it's a very interesting idea. This kind of police force, which is called Panoply, who, as you say, are kind of responsible for protecting democracy in the Glitter Band, which is the orbital habitats that surround the planet Yellowstone. And as you say, I think the comparison with 24 is quite a good comparison, because it's a very exciting plot. It's quite fast paced. And there's some very memorable characters. I like the SF concepts, the world building. I think artificial intelligence is quite a big theme. But I wanted to ask you a bit more about like the whole idea of Panoply's raison d'etre, because they're not like a police force as most people might understand it. As in they don't go out solving crimes. It's more like they need to protect this kind of concept of real-time democracy, which I find is really interesting. Yeah.
I'd kind of sketched in the world building that had gone into the Revelation Space universe already. I'd put in this idea that there's lots of different sort of human sort of societies and factions in these books, but one of the dominant ones are the Demarchists. And I've got the word from a really good short novel by Joan D. Vinci called Outcasts of Heaven's Belt, which was, I think it was sort of mid-70s or something like that. It's a really, really good sort of science fiction novel. I thought I really like the word Demarchy, but then I can't have it. I can't pinch it. Damn. But then I found out an actual word. You know, it had come from sort of political theory. So I thought, okay, I can legitimately have that one now. But I've always tried to sort of say that, you know, it was Joan D. Vinge's. I always used to say, so Joan D. Vinge was the wife of Werner Vinge. And I always used to call it Werner Vinge, but I've heard a lot of people saying Werner Vinge, so that's where I'm going with it.
I had the same experience. It's through watching YouTube videos that I picked up. Oh, they pronounce his name or her name Vinge. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're both really great writers. And, but you know, it was her book that particularly sort of sent me chasing off that, going after that particular rabbit. So then I started thinking, as you said, well, I want something like a police force, but I don't want them just being ordinary space cops, because that's been done. So I thought, what if they don't really care about loads of crimes? They only, you know, the habitats that they oversee are more or less allowed to do what the hell they like. They can run their own affairs, and they have their own internal police organizations. And it's really sort of laissez-faire. They can do what they like, but they mustn't corrupt the voting process at any point. So as long as they abide by the rules about all the citizens getting a real-time vote, that's all that Panoply really care about. And I was writing this. It wasn't long after that. You know, you cast your mind back to sort of 2000, when there was that business in Florida where they were counting the number of hanging chads on these electronic voting records, you know, to determine if, was it Jeb Bush was going to be the governor or something like that, you know. There was a lot of stuff in the media about the sort of intricate mechanics of voting processes, and I suppose we've heard a lot more of that in recent years with, you know, the legal cases over the Dominion system in you know, the voting systems in America, and all the claims and counterclaims about voter fraud, things like that. So I you know, I'm certainly glad I landed on that topic, because it's not sort of played out in any way. It still feels quite there's a lot of mileage in it, and but it still gave me latitude to have my police cops, you know, my Panoply cops go anywhere anywhere they like, as long as it's on a pretext of looking out for something that's gone wrong in democracy as they implement.
And just to clarify, the citizens of the Glitter Band they vote on pretty much everything. Yeah.
I mean, there's this. I mean, I'm not well read in it, but this Demarchy thing was the idea of an absolute democracy. You don't really have sort of echelons of government. You just have citizen will. So people are voting on things constantly, and it's sort of very sort of flat electoral structure, I think. Now, the way I implemented it in the Revelation Space books is that everyone's neurally linked into this voting system. So all the citizens have an implant, many implants, but they have particular implants that no matter what they're doing during the day, they will be constantly polled on certain minor or major issues that they're required to issue a vote on.
Right.
And the idea is, I thought that this has been going on for so long that it's almost become a subconscious process. You know, they're voting constantly, almost like, I suppose, when we check notifications on our phones. You know, it's like, oh,
yeah, they
might be voting on getting death sentence or something. Yeah, never mind, get on with it. But it's a real time process, and it happens. It's mediated via neural implants, and there are 10,000 space habitats orbiting this planet in another solar system, and each one of these space habitats has got a sort of big computer in the middle of it, which kind of collates the votes and then broadcasts them out for sort of central processing. And it's that level that Panoply have access to. You know, they can access the central computer, but if someone's if they're sort of walking through these habitats and they find that there's some horrible dystopian thing going on, they actually don't care because that's outside their remit. You know, they say, well, this is just what these citizens voted for, so we'll leave that. As long as they don't mess around with the democracy, then anything is fair game.
Right. Yeah. It's a very interesting concept, and I think it's a useful kind of world building device to create the institution of Panoply and then the crises that then emerge in these series. So the Prefect, as it was originally called, was published in 2007, I think. Now, did you originally envision that to be as like a standalone novel, or did you always have this idea in your mind that you're going to expand it into a series?
I think I thought when I was writing it, I thought I'll do another one of these, and it'll come in pretty quick fashion. You know, I'll because I was thinking about like 24, obviously, or season 1, season 2. Yeah, I'll do another Prefect book, because I put a lot of energy into making up the you know, the organization and the protocols of Panoply and the kind of technology they have access to. I didn't want them to have weapons in the, you know, ray guns or lightsabers or anything like that. I wanted it to feel quite different. So I put a lot of energy into that, and I thought, well, you know, I wouldn't mind doing this again, you know. But I couldn't. An idea didn't present itself, should we say, for another Prefect novel, and I wasn't really pushing against it that hard. I had other things I wanted to get on with. There were, you know, other books that I had to get out of my system. But I was amazed that it took me as long as it did to come up with a second one. But it was just a sort of oh my God, like 8 years have gone by or whatever it was, you know. And
so that's this book.
Yeah.
Elysium Fire, which came out in 2018.
Yeah. Well, I started writing it in 2016, so it would have been about 10 years after I was writing the first book, you know. But
how did this book come about, or specifically your conception of what Elysium Fire might be?
I had embarked on a 10-book deal with Delance round about the early 2010s, and at the start of that deal, I had to sort of give them an outline of what I was likely to write for those 10 books, and I think I said something like a sequel to the Prefect, so it was kind of in there that there would be maybe 1 or 2 sequels to the Prefect, but I had other stuff. I wanted to do the Poseidon's Children sequence as well, so I had this other sort of future history I wanted to get off my chest. But I thought, at some point I really have to do that other Prefect book, and then the first book is quite. There's quite a lot of action in the first book, and there's quite a lot of kinetic action. There's a lot of big stuff flying around and things blowing up and things being blown up, spaceships shooting at spaceships, that kind of thing, habitats exploding. And I thought, I don't want to go bigger with the second book, because that's going to be ridiculous, because then by the time I'm doing the third one, I'm going to have to blow up everything. It seemed self-limiting. I thought I definitely want to go a bit quieter with the second book, purely so I give myself room for a third book. And then I started thinking along those lines, and I mean, you go back to 2015, 2016. There was a lot of sort of stuff floating around in the media already about authoritarianism and popular, the popular vote and populists. That's the word I'm looking for. Bear with me. It's but not to get into political waters, but you had the ascension of Trump in America. He was sort of emerging as a likely candidate for the election, and then you had the sort of the groundswell that was going to lead to Brexit in the UK, and there were other other things going on in the world that also involve sort of populists and demagogues and things like that. And I thought, well, what if I put one of those into the Prefect sort of universe? Someone who's opposed to the ideals of Panoply, but has a bit of a silver tongue and is able to sort of start turning the popular will against Panoply. So I thought, yeah, that could be good, because the prefects, they can't just go and shoot the guy. They have to abide by their principles, and the principles are quite limiting in what they can do and what they can't do. So I thought that would be interesting. That what happens in a nutshell if you put an anti-democratic agent into a democratic system, and the upholders of democracy must still abide by the principles of democracy. So their hands are tied to some degree, but they Dreyfus has to battle with his conscience about how is he willing to actually go against his deepest beliefs to thwart this developing threat to everything he holds dear. And that's kind of the sort of moral calculus that he has to grapple with during that book. Is how do you deal with a demagogic figure who's undermining your very your most cherished principles,
right,
while still holding those principles dear. I think about this all the time, because I think, well, I've written a sequence of books that sort of put democracy on something of a plinth, but at the same time, all around the world, we see the outcomes of democratic processes that we might not necessarily like.
And when I was reading that book, I
swear that with my conscience.
There are definite analogues with real world events and real world personalities that came to the fore, I thought, in Elysium Fire. And then so that was what, 2018.
Yes.
So as you said, there's a bit of hiatus in terms of the publication between the first book and the second book, and then I think Machine Vendetta, I was under the impression, I think it got delayed, didn't it? Because I was expecting it to come out last September.
It was written, to all intents and purposes, it was finished by this time last year. I delivered it in 2022, and it didn't. It went through the usual round of editing, but there wasn't anything major. But it became clear that it could have come out in the UK last summer, but the American side of publishing generally needs longer lead times, and it was felt that they couldn't meet a summer schedule, and rather than stagger it, it was better to let the UK publication slip, so that at least the American and the UK editions come out at the same time. So you get more of a splash. So that's why it's been put back so long. Yeah. And
actually, I forgot to ask: is there any? I'm assuming there's a publishing reason, but why did the Prefect, the first book, the name get changed to Aurora Rising?
That's all on me, really, because I was never, sometimes you put a title on a book and you're happy with it and it's great, and 10 years later you say, yeah, it's still good. But the Prefect, I never warmed to it as a title. It just didn't quite do it for me. And when we were casting around for a title for Elysium Fire, the thinking was that it ought to be a title in the sort of the something type, that sort of fitted into the pattern. And I couldn't come up with anything. And I was coming up with really pretty good titles that were sort of 2-word titles that were more like Revelation Space or Redemption Arc. And I just at some point flippantly said, it's a pity we can't rename the Prefect, isn't it? And the answer that came back was, well, we could. So I sort of leaned in hard on that, and I proposed the variant title Aurora Rising. Was it a good thing? I don't know. It may have it may have created more confusion than the world really needed, but I own it. I own that decision. I did sort of request that the rejacketed editions of the Prefect / Aurora Rising would be clearly marked as this is the Prefect.
And
so
speaking of which,
I hope no one bought it thinking it was a new book, but I imagine
actually,
that probably.
You know what? I remember a few years ago, I saw an Amazon customer review of a customer complaining that they bought Aurora Rising thinking it was a new book.
I mean, my sort of fallback, my defense was a big fan of James Ellroy, and I know he'd retitled one of his books. So I thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it, because he's better writer than me.
No, I like the title Aurora Rising, and more to the point, I really like the these Gallant covers, and I like the fact that they kind of come as a set. Yeah. Lovely cover design. So, Machine Vendetta. This is the new release. It's finally out. I'm going to try and avoid talking about the plot as much as I can because probably not many people have read it yet. So, but in a nutshell, I'm assuming that this is book 3. I'm assuming the concluding novel in this trilogy. What is it? What is this about, and how does it tie in with the rest of the Prefect Dreyfus series?
Well, the first book introduces. There's a story that plays out in the foreground of the first book.
Right.
By the end of the first book, we've arrived at a situation where there are 2 AIs, hostile artificial intelligences, that have got loose in the computer network that surrounds all these space habitats. But they're not actually a problem because they're so preoccupied with each other. They're antagonistic AIs. So as long as they're fighting each other, waging a kind of digital warfare against themselves, they're not actually getting in the way of people, and people can get on with their lives. In the second book, although again the foreground story is about these populists trying to upset things, the one of the AIs kind of plays a role in the second book, and she's trying to use Dreyfus, shall we say, as a means of outflanking her adversary, and he gives a little ground. She may or may not regret later, but he takes a decision. It seems like the only rational decision he can take at that point is to kind of concede something to her. And my model for that, I was thinking about sort of Silence of the Lambs, where Lecter's in prison, but the FBI guys still have to go and deal with him because he's got little insights that they need. So they kind of have to do that deal with the devil of letting Lecter into their mind because they need his opinions. So I thought, yeah, she's a kind of Lecter figure in this book, but of course she's manipulative as well, like Lecter is. And then, well, I obviously knew that having set those 2 AIs out into the world, something has to be done about them. So there has to be a resolution, and that's the focus of the third book. And it's a book that brings a certain closure to another sort of set of a character arc within the life of Dreyfus is resolved in the third book.
Right.
Beyond that, so, probably getting deep spoiler territory, but it certainly did I think it was going to be a trilogy? No, I never think about those things. It's the third book that features Dreyfus as the main character. Now I have no plans to revisit that universe for any time soon, but if I wanted to, there's actually, I call it interstitial space between books 2 and 3, there's plenty of time between those two books, so I could do another Dreyfus story in there quite easily. I could also do another Panoply story by picking up on one of the other prefects who are kind of they all have a fairly important role to play in the stories. So there's room if I wanted to return to it. There's various angles I could approach, and I could still pick up Dreyfus as a character. Again, without saying too much, but that's all just speculative at the moment.
Well, so this trilogy began life, at least it's in publication, in 2007, and now Machine Vendetta has been published 2024. So it's got quite a long publication history of 17 years.
Scary.
And as you say, in terms of narrative, Machine Vendetta does tie up some plot points from across the series. So is it quite sort of satisfying to see the story achieve fruition after all this time?
Well, I'm satisfied with it. I mean, I know you can't satisfy everyone. I think when the dust is settled, we'll know what readers in general made of it. Well,
I can tell you, I certainly enjoyed it. I love this book, and also from my sort of scouring of reviews online, on Goodreads, on Amazon, and newspapers and stuff, everything I've seen has been very positive. So I think readers are satisfied too.
Well, yeah, I hope they are. It's nice if they are. For me, I think it's the tightest of the three books. It's the shortest of them, but it's not. It's not by accident. It's just I've been trying to write shorter novels for a few years now, and I really tried to bring that discipline to this book and try and bring it in as a much less than 200,000 words to make it a tighter, more tightly integrated novel. It helps because I think it's the first of the preceding two books had significant viewpoint strands from the point of view of the antagonists, and we don't really get that in Elysium as in Machine Vendetta. It's primarily the primary viewpoints are just the prefects. But it's a different type of story. There's not a villain in the sense of the previous books. There's not like an external villain to the action. Well, that's how I see it anyway. But it's like the structure is a little bit different. There's a slight change of focus anyway. So again, I want it to be a tight. I do. Again, sometimes when you look at series books by other writers, the first book's really tight. It's great. And the second book's it's getting a little bit less tight, and then the book 3 is flabby and it has to be split into, and you think I really don't want to go down that pathway. I wanted the books to get tighter, not flabbier with time.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I remember reading some of the Revelation Space books, and Absolution Gap in particular was quite a chunker.
I mean that was the one that sort of broke me. But it was the one I said I'll never do in a book that long again. It's 275,000 words that, and just never mind writing a book like that. I mean, editing it, proofreading it, everything becomes monumental when you're dealing with.
I mean, if you're compared to some writers like Peter F. Hamilton, for example, that's quite modest.
Yeah, everyone brings different sort of. I mean, writers have a certain length that they're comfortable with, don't they? In a certain mode. And I think I'm inclining more to the shorter novel. That's what I'm trying to do. And I'm not saying that there won't be a big book at some point in the future. I'd love to do a big sort of like Dune or something like that. I'd love to do a big one-off space opera where you can kind of really lose yourself in a big universe. But certainly for the next few books, I want to keep them as short as possible.
Okay, so The Prefect Dreyfus series is like we've said, it's actually part of the wider Revelation Space universe. So I think that means now you've got basically 8 novels in that universe, and then there's also some short stories and some novellas. Do you think, is this a universe that you feel? I know we've talked about the possibility of more Prefect stuff, but within Revelation Space in general, is this something you would ever want to revisit, or are you done with it for now?
I'm sort of, I feel like I'm done with it now for the time being, particularly because I did the book before was Inhibitor Phase, which is kind of like an appendix to the first 3 or 4 novels that sort of picks up on some of the themes from Revelation Space. And I got that out of my system, and I've written a few short stories in that universe, and now I've done the book that sort of it's the last book about that's really necessary, should we say? You know, I really needed to tie off that subplot within the Prefect books. It had to be done. I couldn't let it just linger. Anything else, if in a few years I have a great idea for another book in that universe, I'm sure I would want to write it. And I think short stories and novellas, if they come, I'll write them. I quite enjoy writing in that universe, but at the same time, I always say it's like the airspace gets very crowded when you've done 8 books, you know, and umpteen short stories. It's very hard to avoid colliding with a fact of a story. I mean, all I ever wanted to do was just copy Larry Niven. Really, when I was starting out, he had the books he'd written in the '60s leading up to Ringworld. There were novels, and then there were a whole bunch of short stories. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be brilliant to create that, make up future history, you know? And I wanted to do that, and I feel I've done my version of it with the Revelation Space books, you know. So I'm quite happy to take a step back from it now. Not because I'm fed up with it, but just I've got other things I want to get on with, other books, and I'll come back to it if I feel the fire, you know.
Right. So, speaking of which, what are you working on at the minute, or are there any upcoming projects you can tell us about?
I'm nearly done with another book, so I won't say too much about it because I always think I don't want to jinx them. Right. But it's I love this sort of juxtaposition of noir and science fiction. I'm sure it's not everybody's cup of tea, I'm sure, but I keep getting pulled back to it. So what I've done is I've written a book which it's a classic. But it aspires to be a classic 1940s, 1950s gumshoe murder mystery in the Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett vein, but it's set on an enormous generation starship. So it's sort of 1950s Los Angeles wrapped up into a cylinder and sent off into space. And I've had a lot of fun with it. It's nearly finished. That's as much as I'm going to say about that one at the moment.
Okay.
But it's obviously very different it's tonally and thematically different than the preceding books. It's not filled with big cosmic ideas. It's more about a murder mystery that plays out in this particular setting. Of course, there are sort of science fictional aspects to the story. But it's not it's not like House of Suns or any of the other books that have the big sort of cosmological themes. It's rather different in tone. Probably the book that it's closest to would probably be Century Rain, in that it's got that sort of melding of the detective story and the science fiction story in the same book. And again, I'm trying to make it a tight novel. So that one, I don't know. I mean, I'm nearly done with it, but I don't think it'll. I think it won't. The earliest it would be out would be 2025. I think.
Right.
I've got a bunch of. I've had a good productive year with short stories, but they sort of. Some of them have been. I mean, I did a bunch of stuff for the European Space Agency, which is kind of like internal to the European Space Agency. So it's sort of like they've been doing a lot of futurological think tank stuff where they're sort of looking at where the world will be in 2060. And I took some of their scenarios and I wrote little narrative vignettes around these bits of world building. That's purely for sort of distribution within the European Space Agency. So it's been quite fun, but it's not something I can present to the outside world, you know. I've done a couple of other things that are similar. I've written two short stories for a tech company that are working in spatial mapping and 3D mapping of virtual and real spaces, looking at the implications of that technology. So I did one of those, and then towards the end of last year, I wrote a story for New Scientist, which was in the Christmas issue, and I was very pleased with that. I've just written a very long sort of a science fiction story with a horror tinge to it, but again, it's not accepted yet. So I never count my chickens. You know, I always think, I don't like to bank on things being accepted until someone gives me the go ahead, and then I talk about them. But no, I've had a fairly productive year, I think, with writing. You know, this year. Or 2023, and I'm hoping to carry on that momentum into 2024.
Okay, plenty to keep you busy then, and I'll definitely keep an eye out for what's new. I think that about covers it. So yeah, thank you very much for spending some time with me this evening and talking about the Prefect books and your career and stuff. It's so I hope more people can discover your work, and especially the Prefect Dreyfus series, which is one of my personal favorites. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the signal boost. It's really, really kind, and yeah, I mean, hopefully there are readers out there who still haven't found their way to the books, and be nice if they found them and enjoyed them. And obviously, once you found a way into one of the books, there are others you can explore. So it's always nice when people discover the stuff fresh, you know.
Yeah,